Good morning, everybody, and it's good. We've got 2 or 3 screens full of folks. I'd like to, just welcome all of you to the committee, and the subject matter of food security and that area we're going to be spending quite a lot of time on and trying to make it easier and better for people to be sure that we've got adequate supplies of food, and that to ensure people that they aren't going to go hungry. So, and you folks all work in that field, and we need to get your expertise in how to proceed, and if we need to change rules, regulations, laws to make it better for our people and easier to get the food material out to them. I'd like to start off by having the committee introduce themselves. And I think we'll start with Chris. You want to lead off?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chris Pearson from Chittenden District. Great to be with everybody, have everybody here, and look forward to the discussion.
Welcome. I'm Anthony Polina. I represent Washington County, and this has certainly been it will be an important issue, important work in the next couple of weeks. Appreciate you all being involved.
Brian Collmore representing the Rutland District, and what Chris and Anthony both said.
And I'm Corey Parent. I represent Franklin County and Alberg.
Yeah, thank you, senators. And as you folks that are on can see, we have people, our senators on the committee from around the state. And so we're covered pretty well geographically, and we have committee members that are also like Chris Pearson's in finance, and Senator Collmore is in government operations, along with Anthony Polina. Corey, did they assign you to a committee, or are you a floater?
I float where I want to be. It just happens to be here.
And I'm on appropriations, because we all serve on 2 committees. I don't know if I guess we'll start off. We have a list of witnesses, and we'll try to stick with the list, and we'll introduce you, and you can take over from there. Meredith Niles is the first witness on our list, and you're an assistant professor at the Department of Nutrition and Food Sciences at UVM.
Excuse me, Bobby. Samantha Levy is the first person on the list. I'm sorry, it was up there.
Oh, well.
And she has to leave a little early.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll go to Samantha then.
Great. Thank you so much, Senator. Hopefully you all can hear me.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me here at your committee meeting. My name is Samantha Levy, and I'm New York Policy Manager for American Farmland Trust. So my work is mostly in New York, but I actually happen to be in Vermont. It's a second home for me all throughout my life. I'm in Windham County right now. Like I said, I'm New York Policy Manager for American Farmland Trust and for Farm to Institution New York State. And we work to help farmers protect their land, promote sound farming practices on farms. And then we also coordinate the Farm to Institution New York State initiative that works to empower institutions like schools and other public institutions to commit to spending at least a quarter of their food dollars on food from within the state. So I thank you for graciously allowing me to go first, given my time constraints. I really appreciate that. I'm probably a strange one to start off with, but I think I was invited here to talk about our Farm to School program in New York State. So I'm happy to go through that. I have quite a lot of information in my testimony, but I can give you the highlights verbally as well.
Yeah.
So, great. So just so you know a little bit about me, I lead the New York Grown Food for New York Kids Coalition, which advocated for the incentive in New York, our reimbursement incentive for schools. And I have also conducted research on the implementation of that incentive for the last 2 years. So I've got a wealth of information that hopefully can help other states in designing their own incentives. So in New York, related to food security, you know, of course, we think of this program as a food security program, and child food insecurity is rising as a result of the pandemic, probably why you've called this hearing today. We've also found in our research that half of a child's daily calories on average come from school meals when they're in school. And so increasing access to healthy local food at school is a really effective way to improve healthy food access for all children, no matter their socioeconomic status, while also, of course, helping farmers and strengthening local food systems. It's a win-win-win. And in New York, when schools, well, across the country, when schools serve so much milk and cheese and yogurt and apples and other locally grown products, of which you also grow in Vermont and raise, we just think it makes very little sense for them to be spending public dollars to buy them from outside of state when they could very easily support local farmers. So this is why we advocated for this program in New York. And in New York, we've got 2 programs that work hand in hand to enable schools to purchase more farm fresh, healthy food. So we've got the Farm to School incentive, which you may be familiar with. This is a program in New York that quadruples the school's lunch meal reimbursement from the state. It gives them 4 times what they would have gotten, so long as they spend 30% of their lunch food costs on New York grown food. I can talk about definitions if you're curious about that. And then we also have a Farm to School grants program, which invests in training and staff and equipment and transportation to enable schools to reach 30%. So it's a supportive program. And with these 2 programs working hand in hand in New York, we found that we can achieve a lot. So go ahead, Senator, please.
And what is your budget over there for your Farm to School program?
Good question. So for our incentive program, we have it's an entitlement program. So any school that meets it, it will pay them. So we have a budgetary placeholder. New York is considerably larger with New York City. So we've got $10 million as a budgetary placeholder in there for the incentive.
Yeah.
And $1.5 million for the Farm to School grants program has been appropriated for the past several years.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. So within 2 years with this incentive, the number of schools that have successfully reached 30% has grown. This is a successful program. In year 1, we had 7 schools apply. In year 2, we had 57. That was this past year. And those 57 schools combined spent over $5 million on food from New York farms to feed 90,000 students. And the average percentage was actually well above 30%. It was 39%. And there was one school that even hit 63% spending on local food. So the commitment is high. And beyond those that successfully reached 30%, plenty of other schools are purchasing New York products. So it's not just $5 million spent by schools on the local economy. And we found big increases in fruit and veg, and then also in processed products that use New York farm products in there.
Senator Pearson?
Samantha, thank you. I don't want to divert too much into definitions, but it's interesting. We have about 90,000 students in Vermont. And so I'm trying to wrap my head around the scale, and what you're saying, one school got over 60%. Do you have a lot of processing? And is that, that's not something I think we'd be able to replicate. So just help us understand some of what we're talking about. There's only so many apples kids can eat. So, you know what I mean? Can you just help me understand, like, how much is it processed versus raw produce or whatever?
Sure. So in those percentages, I don't have the exact breakdown of how much schools are serving raw versus processed, though something that could be helpful is, so the governor started the New York Grown and Certified program in New York, and their definitions were borrowed for this program. So anything that is a New York food product qualifies, and that can be raw, fresh, or minimally processed produce. It can be fish, it can be dairy. So if it's a processed product, the components that make up that processed product need to be at least 50.1% coming from raw agricultural ingredients in New York State. So it still does create that market. And in addition, the decision was made that processing could take place within or outside of New York State, since it's very common for these products to cross borders to process and then come back and be sold in New York. And on that topic, we saw an enormous increase in the amount of processed products, New York food products, available to schools to buy. And that's not just for schools, but other institutions too, and things from local businesses and small businesses in New York that are processing there, like the New York Grape Juice Company, but also from multinational corporations like Mott's or McCain's that are making New York applesauce or New York French fries to meet this new market demand. And they're creating that market for New York farmers for their products.
Good. Yeah.
And then just a couple of other points to share. Looking ahead, in spite of the pandemic, we found in our research, and I put a link to my report in my testimony, that 75% of schools felt confident that they would reach 30% by 2025 with the right support from the state, of course. And this would increase the amount schools spend at New York farms to $250 million, feeding over 900,000 kids in New York State. And that would be a return on investment of $3.50 for every taxpayer dollar spent. So we also found enormous growth opportunities for dairy here in New York. So that's an important point to make, particularly in the context of Vermont. And just a few things that we learned, and I put a couple of things to keep in mind in my, well, it was a list of 5 or 6, I think, in my testimony. You certainly need a well-designed incentive. The threshold should be challenging, but not too high. And the financial reimbursement should be enough, fairly enough to cover the costs in order to spur action. Schools also need a support system. So the Farm to School Grants program is really important. We found that positions like Farm to School coordinators, which in New York are housed within Extension or at nonprofits or at the schools themselves, that actually connect the school with farmers or help them design menus to incorporate local products or prepare bids, are really important, since at least in New York, our school administrators are pretty strapped for time to try and troubleshoot how to procure local food and serve it to kids successfully. Also to help with tracking for this program. And then we also need capacity at the state level to do it well. You need folks who have expertise in supply chains and guidance released well in advance to schools so they can prepare. It needs to be achievable, not too administratively burdensome. And there needs to be integrity in the tracking and documentation required to prove that schools hit the percentage. So the benefit does go to farmers, and kids do get that access to local food.
Have you, this is Senator Starr, have you had any conversation about I noticed you talked about dairy. Have you had any conversation in regards to moving to school lunches, whole milk instead of 2% milk? Has that been an issue over in New York?
Yeah, we haven't really talked about that at the state level since those decisions are made more at the federal level. At least the requirements are, but we did find that there are many schools, not all, but many schools that are able to buy New York dairy, no matter the fat percentage in the milk.
Yeah. And what about your distribution in New York? How do you set that up?
So you're talking about the supply chain side?
Yes.
Great question. So that sort of sets itself up naturally, and this is where procurement comes in. And as a legislative body, something that we often talk about in New York is looking at New York State's procurement laws and how they interact with the federal regulations that schools need to follow to buy food. That's something I highly recommend taking a look at to make sure, because schools put out bids and they're required to award their bids, if it's above a certain amount, to the least cost, most responsive bidder. So that's important to keep in mind. And in addition, so your question about distribution in the supply chain, certainly there are gaps in our supply chain in New York that need to be recognized and addressed and invested in. But the idea behind this incentive was, if the demand is there, then the market will respond. And we have seen that when it comes to processed products. I think that we are going to need to recognize areas of gaps, like I said, and help move things along in processing and aggregation. But when you have the number one barrier that schools say they face in procuring local food is cost. So when you have a financial incentive that frees them up to be able to ask for in their procurements local food, following the regulations at the federal level, at the state level, and then the market is able to respond to that demand.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Senator Parent?
Yeah, thanks, Samantha. Could you elaborate a little more, and if not, get us information on how your school districts are getting around the fat content in milk to buy local? I'm just interested in more about that.
I'm really not sure, but I could follow up with you if you'd like to. My email is in my testimony. If you want to send me an email, I can put out some feelers to a few schools and ask them.
Yep, I'll follow up. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Yeah. Any other questions for Samantha from the committee? If not, thank you very much for your time, and we're glad to have you on with us this morning.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and apologies for needing to jump, but best of luck with the rest of your agenda here.
This is one advantage of being on Zoom. We can
Yes.
get people like you from long distances to be on with us.
Absolutely. And at any point, if anybody has any questions, please just reach out.
Yeah, thank you for the offer. So we'll move on to Meredith Niles from UVM.
Good morning, Senators. Thank you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a brief presentation to share.
Yep.
I'm assuming you can all
Looks
see
good.
it. Can you see the full slides, or do you see the preview version?
We see them both.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Sciences and the Food Systems program at the University of Vermont. I've been at UVM for over 5 years now, and some of my research focuses on food insecurity. And since COVID-19, I have worked with my two colleagues at UVM, Emily Bellarmino and Farrell Bertman, both in my department, to document and understand the impact of COVID-19 on food systems in Vermont and also across the country. So what I'm going to present today is just a brief overview of some of our most important findings to help give you some data about how Vermonters have been affected by COVID-19. And I'll just share that I shared with Linda, we have 8 separate policy briefs that we've released from all of our work. So there's a lot more depth behind what I'll present here today if you're interested to dig into a topic a little bit further. So the data that we have to inform our decisions here are from 3 rounds of surveys that we've done with Vermonters since March. We did a survey of Vermonters right at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, end of March and early April, with 3,200 Vermonters. We did another survey in June with 1,200 Vermonters. And then we did a survey in September with another 600 Vermonters. So we have nearly 4,000 Vermont perspectives on how they've been affected by COVID-19 to share. What we found in early part of the pandemic was a 33% increase in food insecurity as compared to before COVID-19. And to share a little bit about what that looks like over time with our surveys, I have a graphic here to document that. What we have found is that since COVID-19, nearly 30% of Vermont households have faced food insecurity. And with our data, we've also found that about 1/3 of those are newly food insecure households. So people who were not facing food insecurity prior to COVID-19. So you can see the rates of food insecurity that we found across the different surveys. I should add that these numbers are retrospective to March. So for example, when we asked this question in September, we asked it at any point since COVID-19 began, have you faced food insecurities? And in that most recent survey, we found that 29% of our respondents had faced food insecurity. When we look at who is most likely to be food insecure, what we have found across all of our studies is that households with children are significantly more likely to be food insecure. So this is data from our September survey showing that 41%, the orange bars are food insecure, nearly 42% of households with children were classified as food insecure as compared to only about 24% where there are no children in the household. We've also found that households earning less than $50,000 and respondents without a college education were more likely to be food insecure across all of our surveys. And finally, households with a job disruption were significantly more likely to be food insecure. Across all of the surveys that we did, around 40% of respondents had faced some type of job disruption since COVID-19 in their household. So whether that's a loss of hours, being furloughed, or losing their job, we see about 40% of households have that. And in this bottom graphic here, you can see the breakdown in food insecurity by whether or not someone had a job disruption or did not. So 39% of households with a job disruption classified as food insecure in our most recent survey. We've also found some diet quality impacts. So food security is not just about having enough food, but also about having high quality food in order for people to be healthy and have the nutrients that they need. And in our most recent survey, we've also documented a change in diet quality, especially among food insecure Vermonters. So what we found here was that over 50% of food insecure households told us they're eating less fruits and vegetables since COVID-19 as compared to before the pandemic. So there could be other impacts on reduced diet quality in terms of health outcomes that aren't just about having enough food, but also having good quality food. We've also documented how consumers have shifted where they've purchased food since COVID-19. So this graphic is showing in red a decline in reported respondents' food sources, and then in blue where we've seen gains in those. And I think there's some really interesting, important impacts here across the entire Vermont food system. So our consumers and respondents told us that they're going to farmers markets less, specialty stores, and restaurants especially. We also documented in our most recent survey a 6% decline in people telling us they sometimes or often choose local Vermont products as compared to before COVID-19. But what we do see are some potential new opportunities where we've seen gains in people using grocery delivery, restaurant delivery, and on-farm websites or e-commerce as compared to before COVID-19. We've also documented an increase in the use of food assistance programs in Vermont among respondents to our surveys. So overall, we found that 1/3 of our respondents use some type of food assistance program since COVID-19. And we've also documented an increase in use in those food assistance programs. I know you'll hear from some different people in those programs later on who can talk more about that. We also found in our work that the use of those food assistance programs is more common among food insecure households, households with children, and those households with job disruption. So here you can see we asked about, in our most recent survey, 6 different types of food assistance programs ranging from SNAP and 3 Squares Vermont, food pantry use, the National Guard MREs drop-off, school meals program, the Women, Infants, and Children program, and Meals on Wheels, which serves older Vermonters. And you can see here the breakdown, and you have these slides as well for future reference, what kinds of breakdown and who's using those programs before COVID, since COVID, or at all since COVID-19. And I have just a couple more slides to share. So we did want to share with you some of the results about what Vermonters told us would be helpful. I think there's 3 key messages here. First of all, as we asked about people's concern for food security and food access over time from the beginning of the pandemic until our most recent survey in September, we did find in general, people actually had fewer concerns. You know, the grocery store shelves were no longer empty. They could buy their toilet paper again, for example. But there was 2 major areas where we saw increasing concerns despite COVID-19, in some ways at that point in time becoming less of a challenge. The first was increasing concerns from Vermonters about losing access to food assistance programs. So we saw as more people use those programs, there's increasing concern that people may lose access to them or lose access to the extended benefits that have been possible with COVID-19 relief. The second area where we have strong interest and documented evidence from our respondents is increasing safety. People are still concerned about the safety of going to stores to obtain food and the safety of the supply chain. And that is regardless of whether or not someone is food insecure. And then the final thing is cost and financial help. So in our surveys, we found about 1 in 3 Vermonters really do want and need additional financial assistance. The numbers that we've documented is about $149 a week for food insecure households and about $130 a week for food secure households. We also saw increasing concerns about food costs between our surveys. So a growing concern about the increasing cost of food. And here's a quote from one of our respondents that I think sums that up as I wrap up my slides here. Food prices have gone up, and so I'm much less likely to use the food pantry because of the increased number of people who need help. I try to find other ways to cut down, but mostly have just increased my debt and maxed out credit. And I think that's sort of a silent financial impact that we may not even be seeing the full effect of yet. People who may be maxing out their credit cards or going into debt to afford food. So just to wrap up, and then I'm happy to take any questions, I did want to share we are continuing this research. We have 2 future rounds of surveys planned to continue to document and understand the impact of this issue across Vermont. We've also been working with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, especially Abby Willard, who will be testifying next. We've done a survey of farmers and food businesses across Vermont, and we have a forthcoming report coming out looking at the business impacts on the food system. And then, as I mentioned, and I've shared with Linda, we have put out 8 briefs summarizing all 3 of these surveys that give much more detail for you if you're interested. And finally, I just wanted to note that our team is very interested in conducting any additional analysis that might be useful for you, or if there's any other questions that we could help provide data to inform your decisions, we're really happy to do that. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. And Senator Starr, you're still muted.
You're muted, Mr. Chair. But why don't we go to Senator Collmore?
I think we'll go to Senator Collmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Vice Chair. Meredith, I'm wondering, because we've heard different definitions of insecurity, can you tell us exactly what that means? And I'm also curious, with all the surveys that you did, how did you reach people? Was it an online survey? Was it a paper one? Did you call people? I guess those are my two questions.
Yep, happy to answer those. Okay, so on the first one, great question. You know, there's a lot of definitions and terms. You hear hunger, you hear food insecurity. It's important to clarify those things. The way that we measure that in our survey is through using a validated set of questions from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So the USDA measures food insecurity consistently over time. And we used their 6 set of questions that we asked at all 3 of our surveys over time. So there's 6 questions. I'm happy to share those with the committee. They range from whether or not someone is worried about having enough to eat, whether they have enough money to purchase food, all the way through to actually cutting meals in order to save money, for example, or because they simply didn't have enough to eat. So that is how we measure it. If you answer affirmatively to 2 or more of those questions out of 6, that classifies you as food insecure. That allows us to be able to compare our numbers to other numbers that the USDA has had over time using that same survey methodology. On your second question about our distribution, you know, unfortunately with COVID-19 and with the University of Vermont restrictions, we are not really able to do in-depth work with people in person. And so we have deployed all of these surveys online. And we recognize that that may mean that some people, unfortunately, are not able to participate. And we fully recognize that. But it's been necessary to do it that way just because of COVID-19 at this point. The most recent survey was deployed using a professional survey company. I should mention that all of the surveys were representative to the Vermont population on race, income, and age.
Yep.
So this was a call out survey.
I'm sorry, say that again, Senator?
Yes. This was a call out survey that was done by the group that you hired. In other words, how would people know to go on the website that there was a survey?
Sure. So the first 2 rounds that we did, we established a collaboration with a broad suite of stakeholders across Vermont, including our state agencies, the Vermont Food Bank, Hunger Free Vermont, a number of other groups and organizations. We also did targeted social media ads directing people to the survey. We also did a press release from UVM and did media interviews on Vermont Public Radio and many TV stations and radio stations as well. So we had a multi-pronged approach to get the survey out. And then finally, we had paid ads on Front Porch Forum, which reaches 2/3 of Vermont households. And so the targeted media, social media ads we did were targeted towards populations we knew were not likely to be on Front Porch Forum, especially men and lower income households. So we had a very diverse strategy for those first 2 surveys and then hired a professional company for the third.
Thank you, Mary.
Anything, Senator Pearson?
My questions were similar about the survey. So would we consider it as good as can be these days, basically a poll? I mean, a sampling of Vermonters. Did you allow for geography as well?
Zip codes. So we can tell you about the distribution. I can tell you that we've had respondents in all of our surveys across all counties. I do not feel comfortable taking all of the data down to the county level to say it's representative. It's representative of Vermont, and we have had representation across the state. But we can't predict food insecurity outcomes in some smaller counties because there's been obviously not as many people there. So we've tried to keep the numbers largely sort of at the state level. Although in some cases where we've had enough respondents, like in Chittenden County, we could do that kind of analysis. But yes, it's broadly representative geographically as well.
And are we tracking the country as a whole, or are we worse off? How do we compare?
It's a great question. I'm also running a national effort, the national COVID research team, food systems and food security research team. And so we have actually implemented this survey in 15 states across the US. And so we have very comparative data. Actually, Vermont is on the lower end of impacts as compared to some of the other states that we're working in. But nevertheless, consistent trends across all the states and nationally. The food insecurity rate has gone up. It is consistently higher for households with children. It is consistently higher for BIPOC and Hispanic respondents, and it is consistently higher for people who have had a job disruption across all of our surveys.
Yep. Anthony, Senator Polina.
Yeah, just an observation. I was a little surprised to see that you found that participation in CSAs was down a little bit and farmers markets participation was down a little bit. It's just that it's contrary to what we hear anecdotally, where farmers have said that demand for their CSA has gone up. So it's just, I don't know if it's a question. I just thought it was interesting to see that those had gone down as opposed to going up, which I thought they would have gone up. With farmers markets, it's a little different because people may not want to go. I understand that, but it's just the CSA thing was just very different than what we've heard from other people anecdotally. So it's just a thought. I don't know if it's a question.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, one of the things we're trying to do in our work with Abby is to triangulate some of this. So we have this farmer and food business survey we've done. We have these consumer surveys that we've done. And so trying to understand, like, who are the people who have been unable to maintain their CSAs? Certainly there's been a growth with some populations, but others, may not be able to do that. So we're certainly trying to look at all this data together moving forward to have a better understanding of that.
Thanks.
Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, sorry, Senator Polina makes me think. His question, that slide about where people are getting the food, was that among people that identified as food insecure, or that was across the broader population?
Across the whole population, and it was, it was self-reported. So where they said they had food or they obtained food prior to COVID-19, since COVID-19, I'm certainly happy to dig into that CSA result to see who is it, who are the kinds of people who maybe started CSAs and who are the kinds of people who stopped CSAs, because we did see in some earlier research that food insecure populations were possibly more affected by not being able to utilize the local food system in different ways.
Well, I would guess the agency has some of that information, but thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions from the committee members? If not, thank you very much, Meredith. You folks have done a lot of work there, and I'm sure we'll use some of your numbers and figures when we get to presenting the bill or whatever we do to move forward in a positive way. So thanks.
Thank you.
Our next witness is Abby Willard from the Ag Agency. And good morning, Abby. It's good to see you and welcome.
Good morning. Good morning, Senators. I am happy to visit with you this morning on a few topics. I'll say every time I hear Meredith speak about the data and the survey collection that they did this year, I'm really appreciative of having such a strong research team at the university and focused here in Vermont, looking at food procurement and additionally on the farm and food business side. So I might recommend that there's a variety of different follow-up testimonies when the committee has time to talk further about some of the farm and food business survey results. So good morning, Abby Willard. I'm the director of the Ag Development Division at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. A few pieces that I wanted to share this morning, also really cognizant of the long list of testimonies that you have on your docket for the morning. So I might recommend, if there's interest for further testimony this session, to talk about the agency's Farm to School grant program in greater detail. Additionally, I'm going to give a few highlights about some pivots that happened in our Farm to School program, our plans for 2021, and then a little bit about the COVID Ag Assistance Program that benefited Farm to School. We also hope to be able to visit with this committee again collectively on our what we call VCAP, so Vermont COVID-19 Ag Assistance Program impacts and outcomes in the coming weeks. So I'll do my best to be brief so you can move along on your list. I also was inspired by Samantha's testimony from New York. I'm happy to talk additionally about the new local definition that was passed by you and others last session, and how that might apply in any future farm to school incentive programs, as well as share how that connects to a U.S. Department of Agriculture farm to school grant that the agency received to help schools look at tracking local. So lots of topics for us to engage on. So really quickly though, from the food insecurity side, wanting to think about two sides, both the activities that have happened in schools, and then a little bit on the ag production side, sort of thinking about where is our food coming from, how did our ag businesses fare from a food production side. So in 2020, the Vermont Farm to School grant programs, which I believe that Betsy Rosenbluth will talk in greater detail about, we had grantees that we gave a lot of flexibility to in April, recognizing that they really had some primary focus on keeping kids safe, healthy, and well-fed. And so there were a variety of grantees that really needed to take a break on their farm to school activities and focus on more of those immediate needs. So we were able to offer the opportunity for extensions if our farm to school grantees needed such support. Because these were 2-year grants, we haven't had a school take us up on that offer and have instead felt like they have an additional year to do the work. And also really important to acknowledge that the TA providers, again, a population that you'll hear from in this testimony, and again, have been very flexible and have offered a lot of support to our schools in their farm to school program, both development and implementation. So our plan for 2021, briefly, we have just over $212,000 to support the program. The annual general fund appropriation of $171,875 is coupled with some philanthropic investments that we receive each or have received for recent years. And we've elected to make some changes to the program that we'll just again briefly highlight here, and then happy to talk about in greater detail, and might even make sense to bring in Trevor Lowell, who's our farm to school program manager, to talk in greater detail with the committee. So one of the first changes is that we're delaying the launch of our grant program. So historically, they've straddled 2 different school years. So awards have been granted in the fall. They get started, and then summer break comes, and then they re-pick up their programs again the following school year. So we are delaying the programs so that, again, they'll sort of generally encompass one entire school year. And we're going to limit the grants to 1 year. So with a holistic level of technical assistance and coaching that will continue. We're adding a new component to the program this year, which really sort of focuses a bit on the piece that Meredith shared around the reduction of fruit and vegetable consumption, and creating a CSA, or a community supported agriculture program that's really focused on early childcare funding, that's offering real nutritious feeding opportunities at centers and schools, with a real attention to that direct procurement from local farms. So the concept would be that a childcare center or school would purchase a CSA share directly from a FAR, and the Farm to School grant program funds would support to up to 80% of the costs for that share, no more than $1,000. So centers could purchase multiple shares for multiple centers, but the idea is to really make a direct connection between local food and the feeding programs for our youth. The additional program piece is really around a farm to school vision program. So wanting to create some real opportunities for schools to work with the really talented nonprofit community in Vermont around Farm to School to do something new and different. So they could really look at the impact of a particular project or the sustainability of their meal program, address food security, talk about diversity, equity, inclusion through a particular project. So looking to create some more flexibility in the Farm to School program for some of these unique partnerships. So again, that's all I plan to sort of share, sort of a high level intro with, if there's questions or more interest, happy to discuss it additionally. So then I wanted to just talk quickly about the VCAP Farm to School grants that went out. And so there is a one pager here that I'll try to do a quick screen share. You also have access to this. I shared it with Linda. So can you see this one pager?
Yep.
Yes, okay. So this is sort of an overview of the Farm to School coronavirus relief grants that were invested based on your efforts on wanting to allocate $100,000 of the coronavirus relief funds in Act 154, which became, or H 969, focused on schools and childcare centers. So you'll have an opportunity to look at this in your own time in greater detail. So this was importantly a collaboration with the Agency of Education and the Agency of Agriculture. So there was an opportunity for us to have one application for schools and two different funding opportunities captured in that same application. So a wonderful efficiency in state government on our side for there to be one application that the Agency of Education managed and ran, and a real ease in application for the schools. So they could apply through one application and access various funding sources. So it meant that upfront we had to do some important partnership, but we also avoided any redundancy by creating the application together, doing the promotion collaboratively through the network and a variety of partners, as well as from the agencies of education and agriculture. So really in the true spirit and genesis of what our Farm to School efforts are in Vermont. And I would say, give credit to you all in your vision of allocating $100,000 for this program, both the concept, but also the amount. It was pretty close to perfect. We received $118,000 in requests, and we were able to award $100,000 of those grants.
Abby, any idea why 5 of the applicants didn't receive a grant? Because I see there was 27 submitted, 22 that were awarded a grant.
Yeah, so my understanding is that 4 of those 27 applications that were submitted were deemed ineligible based on the legislative authorizing language. And then 22 were awarded, and that was again up to $100,000, which was the appropriation that was available.
Yep.
And again, acknowledging that Rosie Kruger can probably speak to either today or at another time, sort of the complementary infrastructure grant support that existed within the Agency of Education, which had far greater impact and more resources to allocate. So what I wanted to share, and at least on this one pager, was both the total funds that were requested, the dollars that went out the door, and then examples of a few of the projects. So they were really focused on creating a safe learning environment for kids in school during the pandemic. So classrooms set up outdoor spaces. They created sort of outdoor learning environments. So one example at Vermont Academy was a fire ring and campfire cook sites at school. Some were able to address some of their food security issues in offering homemade snacks in the school by having a freezer and refrigerator installed, creating picnic tables and tented areas outside of the school so the classrooms could have more isolated and safe outdoor learning environments. So really great projects, really creative partnerships, and important work that happened at a time when schools were really struggling just to meet the basic needs of their responsibility as educators and caregivers during the day. So let me stop sharing here if I can. Oh, weird. I'm not sure that I've lost the functionality in my Zoom here. Sorry for that. You guys are still seeing my screen, aren't you?